There are several annotations are available to represent our Java class as Spring Bean. Good. Who will create the object for Spring Beans? Who will
IOC
manage the life
container.
IOC
cycle?
container.
IOC container is going to manage life cycle of the Spring
Spring
Beans.
Bean.
Now, what is the difference between normal Java class and Spring Bean class?
In Spring
Normal
Bean
Java
class,
class,
IOC
container
container
take
will
care
use
of.
Spring Bean
like
lifecycle can
command
manage by
we
a
have
IOC
IOC
container.
uh,
Create object. What is Spring Bean?
but
In
in
IOC
Java
container
class,
create object.
it will not.
Right. We have several annotations to represent Java class as Spring Bean. First one, we are using at component, then at service we are using, at repository we are using, at configuration we are using, at bean we are using, at controller we are
Controller.
using, and at rest
REST
controller
controller we are using.
we are going to use to represent our class as Spring Bean. Good. The classes which are represented as Spring Beans will be managed by IOC container. Will be managed by IOC container.
Container.
Now, here several annotations we have. All these annotations are class level annotations except at bean. Right. At bean is method level annotation. It is a special annotation. At the rate bean is
Is a method
method
level.
level annotation. At the rate bean is method level annotation. Now, when we will go for at bean annotation, guys?
When
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 we
we
go
are
for
going
We
for
need to
customizing the
customize
object, then
our
we
object.
can go for
Customize.
@bean.
customize,
the time we are
if
using
you want to customize the object creation of a particular class, then we are going to use at bean annotation. Now, whenever I give a component at the class level, programmer will create the object for that, or IOC is going to create the object for that class.
IOC will create the object.
IOC will
If
create.
I give a component annotation, then IOC container is going to create the
Create the
object
class.
for that.
Yes, sir.
IOC container is going to create the object for that class. If I give at service, if I give at service annotation, who will create the object for that class?
IOC
That's a container.
IOC container.
IOC container is going to create. If I give at repository, still IOC is going to
Yes.
create the object. If I give controller and rest controller, still IOC is
Yes,
going
sir.
to create object for those classes, and will that life cycle, the life cycle of the classes also will be managed by IOC container.
Container.
Guys, please read these annotations once. Just remember what we discussed about those annotations in the last session. Component, service, repository, configuration, bean, controller, and rest controller. Right. What is the purpose of configuration annotation, guys?
to give the
What is the purpose of configuration annotation?
If you
Remove-
want to
remove
define the
the, sir, XML
configuration
file, sir.
properties, then we can go for configuration.
You want to write some configuration required for our project.
Sir.
If we want to write the configuration which is required for our project, then we will use configuration annotation at the Java class level. The Java class which contains at configuration annotation will be considered as a configuration class. That will be considered as a configuration class. Inside the configuration class, we are going to customize the objects creation. We are going to write the configurations that is required for our application development. Good. Now, next, what is at component? What is at component? Come on, what is at component?
At component is a stereotype annotation. Using that, we can define the class as a Spring Bean class.
Exactly. So at component is a stereotype annotation. Using that, we can represent our class as Spring Bean.
Bean.
Then what about service and repository?
So
This
Same.
also stereotype
The
Sir,
same,
this
same.
functionality wise
It also
same.
same annotation,
Same
but
as,
we can
same
use
as.
for the different perspective.
Those two are also, that service and repository annotations are also stereotype
Stereotype.
annotations only.
stereotype annotation.
They are also stereotype annotations only.
Stereotype annotation.
Now, by using them also, we can represent our Java classes as Spring Beans. Now, sir, if a component, service, and repository all are used to represent our class as a Spring Beans, then what is the difference? Then what is the difference between those three? Then what is the difference between those three?
We are using in different layers, different annotations to readability purpose.
We
Yes,
will
sir.
use them in
No.
layer wise. We are going to use them in the layer wise.
Layer wise.
If you are developing a class for persistent layer, if you are using your class, if you are developing a class for your persistence layer, then you need to use at repository. If you are developing a class for persistent layer, then we will represent that as at repository. Now, let us go to our project. We created user DAO class and represented as a Spring Bean by using at repository. Now, read this. Open this annotation. Some documentation is available for at repository. Now, see here what they are saying about at repository. It indicates that an annotated class is a repository originally defined by domain-driven design, a mechanism for encapsulating storage, retrieval, and search behavior, which emulates a collection of objects. Now, teams implementing traditional Java WE patterns such as data access object may also apply this stereotype to DAO classes, though care should be taken, understand the distinction between the data access object and DDL style repositories before doing. So what they are saying is, boss, if your class is responsible for storage, retrieval, search behavior, which deals with the collection of objects, for that you can use at repository. And they are saying that you can use this repository annotation for DAO classes also, data access objects. For that purpose, you can use this. Right now, so a class that's annotated is eligible for Spring translation, data access exception translation when used in conjunction with the persistence exception translation post processor. So whenever you use this at repository annotation, this class is going to translate that data access exceptions into understandable format. So what they're saying, if your class is responsible to perform storage, perform retrieval, perform storage, perform retrieval, perform search behavior with a collection of objects. And if your class is dealing with data access objects like DAO layer, then you can use this repository annotation. So the purpose is to represent the class as a Spring Bean. But for what type of classes it is recommended to use? It is recommended to use at the DAO layer. If your classes are trying to perform if your classes are responsible for persistent logic, then we are going to use this repository annotation for those classes to represent them as Spring Beans. Next, go for service. Go for service. At service annotation. Open the documentation for at service. Guys, these are not my statements. These are Spring documentation statements. Indicates that an annotated class is a service originally defined by domain-driven design, an operation offered as an interface that stands alone in the model with no encapsulated state. Right now, so generally, when you are developing a business layer, first we will develop a interface. For that interface, we will write a implementation classes. In such scenarios, we are going to use this at service annotation to represent our class as a Spring Bean. Indicates that an annotated class is a service originally defined by domain-driven design, an operation offered as an interface that stands alone in the model with no encapsulated state. May also indicates that a class is a business service packet or something similar. This annotation is a general purpose stereotype and individual teams may narrow their semantics and use as appropriate. Right now, this annotation serves as a specialization of component, allowing for implementation classes to be auto-detected through class path scanning. So whenever we use at service annotation, it will scan and auto-detect the implementation classes of those interfaces. So this is a general purpose annotation, general purpose stereotype annotation to represent your class as a Spring Bean. But generally, people will use this class in the business service packet patterns. So where you are writing the core business logic, those classes will be represented as service classes. Those classes will be represented as service classes. Are you able to follow this? So when to go for at service, when to go for at repository, when to go for at service, and when to go for at repository. So if your class is dealing with persistent layer, then we will represent that class as at service. Right now, if your class contains core business logic, if your class contains core business logic, which is having an interface and implementation classes, then we will go for at service annotation. At service is a general purpose stereotype annotation to represent our class as a Spring Bean. Very good. Now, let us go for at component. Let us go for at component. So what is the purpose of at component? At component annotation also is used for representing our class as Spring Bean. So let us see the documentation, what they are talking about component. What they are talking about component. Yeah. Here I represented email utils class as a Spring Bean by using at component annotation. Let me open this component. Yep, read it. What is component? Component annotation indicates that an annotated class is a component. Such classes are considered as candidates for auto detection when using annotation based configuration and class path scanning. So whenever you represent your class as a component, those classes will be auto detected as part of component scanning. That is called class path scanning. Class path scanning, the classes which are represented with the component will be scanned and they will be recognized as a Spring Beans. Now, right. So by using any one of these annotation, you can represent our class as Spring Bean. Either component you can use, service you can use, repository also you can use. So all are belongs to same family, minor differences are available. So repository will be used at the persistent layer component. Service annotation will be used at the business layer component. Normal classes which you want to enable them for auto wiring, for those utility classes we are going to use this kind of component annotation. All right, fine. Next, we used at configuration annotation. So already I think we have discussed about it. So if you want to customize any configuration in your application, then we are going to write the at configuration annotation. At configuration annotation. Lot of documentation is there for this, guys. Lot of documentation is there. Indicates a class declares one or more bean methods and may be processed by the Spring container to generate bean definitions and service request for those beans at runtime. So why we will go for that configuration? If you want to declare one or more bean methods in your application, then we are going to use at configuration. So this is the method: instantiate, configure, and return that bean by using at bean annotation. So if you want to customize the bean creations by using bean methods, those bean methods we can write in the configuration class. Guys, can I write the bean method in any Spring Bean class, or I should write only in the configuration class?
We can write
Only write
anywhere
in the
in the class.
configuration.
Any
Any
class,
Spring
sir.
class, sir.
We can write that in any Spring
Any
Bean
class.
class.
Yes.
Not mandatory that we should write only in the configuration, but it is recommended to write in the configuration class. So could you please read this description, the documentation given by Spring about configuration annotation? It indicates that a class declares one or more methods and may be processed by the Spring container to generate bean definitions and service request for those beans at runtime. Okay, now here we are writing a method. That method is returning an object and it is having a annotation called addBean. So now tell me, what is purpose of addBean?
If you want to customize the object at a meta level, then we can go for bean at that bean.
Right, exactly. Fine. So with this we understood what is purpose of add configuration. Now tell me, what is the purpose of addBean? What is the purpose of addBean annotation? What is the purpose of addBean annotation?
It
Read
is
it.
used at method level.
Available.
Customize bean creation.
Yeah, read it. What is the purpose of addBean? Come on. What is the purpose of addBean annotation?
To manage the method by a Spring IOC container.
Whenever you write a method which produces a bean, that means that method is returning a object and that object should be managed by the IOC container, then you will go for addBean annotation. addBean annotation indicates that a method produces a bean to be managed by the Spring container. Okay, so you have a method. That method will produce one object. That means a bean object. That object should be managed by the Spring container. In that scenario, we will write this. The names and semantics of the attributes to this annotation are internally similar to those of element in the Spring XML schema, for example. So earlier, people used it to go for XML configuration. But now we are not using any XML configuration. In the XML, we will represent the class as a bean by using bean tag. But nowadays, are we using that XML configuration or we are not using that XML configuration? We are not using that XML configuration. We are going for completely annotation based approach. We are going for annotation based approach. Good. Now come to a component. We know what is the purpose of component. It is a annotation to represent our class as a Spring Bean. It will make our application class, it will make our classes eligible for component scanning. Service. For business layer components, we are going to use @service annotation. Repository. For persistent layer components, we will use @repository annotation. All these three are used for what? Representing class as a Spring Bean. Then what is @configuration? If you want to represent your Java class as a configuration class, then we will go for @configuration annotation. Generally, in the configuration classes, people will write one or more bean methods. What do you mean by bean method? So if a method is annotated with @bean annotation, then that is called as a bean method. What is the purpose of this bean method? The method which is returning a object, that object will be represented as Spring Bean and will be managed by IOC container. All the above four annotations are class level. Only that bean annotation is method level annotation. You write the method and return the object that will be represented by IOC container if you use @bean annotation at that method level. Next one, controllers and REST controllers. Controllers and REST controllers are related to Spring Web MVC. So when we are going to develop web applications, at that time we will discuss about what is controller, what is REST controller, when to go for controller and when to go for REST controller. Got it? So these are the very basic annotations that we are going to use in our daily life as part of boot applications development. Are you guys comfortable with all these annotations except controller and REST controller? Those we have not yet discussed. Those things we will
Yes, sir.
discuss Spring Web MVC part. That is part 3 of our course. Okay. So one annotation is a special, that is bean, that you have to remember. Remaining all annotations are method level. Only this bean annotation is class level.
No, sir.
No,
Be
sir,
it
yes,
method
sir.
level or at class level.
Yes, sir.
Right. Good. Now, guys, do you know how component scanning is working in the Spring Boot?
Yes, sir.
Do you guys know how component scanning will work in the Spring Boot?
Yes,
First of
sir.
all, what is
Sir.
component scanning? How it is working in the Spring Boot? What is component scanning? How it is working in the Spring Boot?
Component scanning, it will start from the base package.
Component scanning is the process of identifying
Identifying the
Spring Bean classes available in the
application.
project.
As well as sub package.
Component scanning is the process of identifying
Spring Bean class in the
Spring beans.
Spring Beans available in the application. How it will identify the Spring Bean classes based on these annotations. If a class contains any of these annotations, then that class will be considered as Spring Bean.
Spring Bean.
You will understand.
Yes, sir.
Earlier, people used to represent Java class as a Spring Bean by using XML approach. But nowadays, XML approach is outdated. We are going for annotation
Annotation.
approach, right? So we have several annotations to represent our classes as Spring Beans. Now, so whenever component scanning is happening, it will check, does that class contain any one of these annotation or not? If these annotations are available, if any one of these annotation is available, then it will treat that class as a Spring Bean, and IOC container will take care of that class object creation. Okay. Now, from where the component scanning will start and how the component scanning will happen?
Base
It will
package.
start from the base package.
Component scanning will start from base package. What is base package in the Spring Boot?
Base
What is
package
base
is
package?
available in the
Start.
start class.
In the start
Starting
class.
The start class package is considered as a base package.
package.
So
Base
first it will
package.
scan the base package. After that it will scan sub packages of the base package. What is sub package of the base package?
A package should
Mm,
starts with
Package
base,
should
base
start the
package
same
name.
name,
Same name.
which is belongs to the base
Belongs to
package.
the base package, right?
So we can say is a sub package of base package. Naming convention should be the same.
No, we can use other annotation.
Sorry. Come on. What is sub package? The package which is starting with the base package name is called as sub package of the base package. Guys, all of you clear with this one?
Yes, sir.
Very good.
Yes.
Very good. Fine. So with this we understood how to create a boot application and what is the bootstrapping process of the boot application and what is the start class in the Spring Boot, what is run method and what is boot application annotation. Are you guys comfortable with the internals of this?
Yes, sir.
Now tell me what is start class in the Spring Boot?
Application dot.
Class name can be anything. Class name can be anything. Okay, what is start
The
class?
class which contain other than Spring Boot
It is entry point for the
Entry
application.
point of the
execution.
application.
Class containing main method.
main
Right. Start class is the entry point for
Entry point.
boot application execution. So Spring Boot application execution always will start from main method. Inside the main method, we are calling Spring application.run method. So what is the purpose of Spring application.run method?
To bootstrap the application.
Spring application.run method is a predefined method which contains bootstrapping logic for our boot application execution, like loading the components.
environment setup.
Right now, starting the IOC container, printing the
Stop
banner,
watch, prepare environment,
stop
print
watch,
designer,
environment
Printing
preparation,
container,
printing
yeah.
the banners,
container.
starting the IOC container, calling the runners, and
Run.
returning the
Print
references of the
login,
IOC container.
stop
That is the
watch,
part of run method.
run
Run
Now,
method.
So is it mandatory to execute the run method or is it optional to execute the run method?
Mandatory.
Is it mandatory?
Mandatory.
It's mandatory to execute the run method.
Run method.
Very good. Now, what is Spring Boot application annotation?
It contain
That one annotation is equal to
Equal to 3 annotation.
Three annotations.
that one annotation is equal to three
Three
annotations.
annotations.
What are those three annotations?
At the rate component scan,
At-
at the rate configuration,
Boot configuration, auto configuration,
Auto
and
configuration.
component
Boot
scan. Boot configuration means it will represent that class as a configuration class.
Configuration.
What is auto configuration? It will load the components which are required to run our application.
application.
What is component scanning? The process of identifying Spring Bean classes available in the project.
Project.
How it will identify the class is a Spring Bean class or not?
Annotations with
Annotation,
at the rate.
stereotype annotation.
Annotations. Now,
Annotation.
a class contains a component, service, repository, or configuration, or controller, or REST controller. It will consider that as a Spring Bean, and it will check is there any method which is having @bean annotation. Then that method also will be called. That method will give the object. That object also will be represented as a Spring Bean. Controller, REST controller concepts will come in the Spring Web MVC module. All the annotations are whatever I mentioned here. They are class level annotations. Only Bean is the method level annotation. So with this, we just completed our discussion related to start class in the Spring Boot. From last 3-4 days onwards, we are trying to understand what is the start class in the Spring Boot, how that start class executing internally, what is that run method is doing, what is application annotation, boot application annotation, what is the component scanning, what is auto configuration, what is configuration annotation bean, what are the stereotype annotations are available. We understood those concepts. All of you comfortable with that?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Anybody having any questions? No questions. Very good, sir. Very good. Fine, guys. In the tomorrow session, we are going to talk about IOC container, dependency injection, setter injection, constructor injection, field injection. Those concepts will be discussed in the tomorrow session. With this, I'm a little bit early. I'm closing the session today. So tomorrow we are going to continue, and I will reply to your emails today. If anybody is newly joining for this course, please visit our website, that is ashokit.in. Please provide your details in the registration form, which is available for Spring Boot with microservices. You will receive a mail from our side with the previous class recordings also.